The moon cast long shadows across the weathered porch as Emmett Blackwoods raised his rifle, finger steady on the trigger. The figure hunched over his supplies froze, then slowly turned. Instead of the desperation he expected, her eyes held something else, defiance mixed with quiet dignity. Rain-soaked and trembling, the young Apache woman stood her ground, chin lifted despite her circumstances. "I'm not here to steal," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have nowhere to go. May I work for you?" Lowering his rifle slightly, Emmett studied her face. The hardness there matched his own. Two souls shaped by loss, standing at a crossroads neither had foreseen. Could two broken spirits find healing in the harshest territory known to man? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emmett Blackwoods lowered his rifle but didn't set it aside. Dawn was still hours away, and the storm showed no sign of letting up. Lightning flashed, illuminating the woman's face, young but weathered, perhaps late 20s. Her long black hair hung in wet ropes around high cheekbones and eyes dark as the night itself. "Work?" he repeated, his voice rough from disuse. "Ain't much work here a woman can do." "I strong," she said, the English broken but determined. "I work hard." Emmett had spent 15 years alone on this patch of Arizona territory, ever since Sarah and their unborn child had been buried on the hillside behind the house. 15 years of silence broken only by the occasional supply run to Copper Springs, 10 miles east. "Got no place for you to sleep," he said, already wondering why he wasn't simply sending her away. Something in those proud eyes, perhaps. Something familiar. "I sleep there." She pointed to the barn. "I not afraid." Another flash of lightning revealed a small leather pouch hanging at her waist, decorated with beadwork he recognized as Apache. The newspapers in Copper Springs had been full of stories about the Apache problem. Soldiers rounding up bands to force them onto reservations. Raids on outlying ranches, settlers forming militias. "You Apache," he said, not a question. She nodded once, chin still high. "Chiricahua." Emmett's finger moved away from the trigger. "Army looking for your people." "Army kill my people," she replied, no self-pity in her voice, just cold fact. The rain intensified, drumming on the tin roof of the porch. Emmett sighed, suddenly feeling every one of his 58 years. "One night," he said finally. "Barnes got fresh hay in the back stall. Come morning, we'll see." Relief flickered across her face, quickly masked by that same stoic pride. She nodded again. "Your name?" he asked as she turned toward the barn. "Najoni," she said softly. "It mean beautiful in your tongue." Emmett watched her walk away, a straight-backed shadow dissolving into the rain. He remained on the porch long after she disappeared into the barn, rifle cradled in arms that had once held a wife, listening to the storm and wondering what kind of trouble he'd just invited onto his land. Come morning, he half expected her to be gone, disappeared with whatever supplies she could carry. Instead, he found her in the chicken coop, gathering eggs with careful hands. She'd found an old bucket and had already drawn water from the well. "Hungry," she said simply, holding up the eggs. Emmett nodded, mildly surprised. "Kitchen's round back." He watched as she efficiently built up the cookstove fire and prepared a simple breakfast. Her movements were economical, no wasted effort. When she slid a plate of eggs and bacon in front of him, he noticed small scars on her hands and a larger one that ran along her forearm, old wounds long healed. "Where'd you come from?" he asked between mouthfuls. "Mountains," she replied, pointing northeast toward the Chiricahua Range. "Soldiers come. Many die. I walk many days." Emmett had fought in the war between the states, had seen what men could do to each other, had done some of it himself. He knew the look of someone who'd seen too much death. "I need help with the fence on the north pasture," he said abruptly. "Can you handle tools?" A flicker of something, perhaps surprise, crossed her face, quickly replaced by determination. I learn fast. And so began an uneasy truce. By midday, Emmett had to admit she hadn't exaggerated her strength or willingness to work. She matched him post for post along the fence line, learning quickly how to stretch wire and hammer nails. When Jonas Wheeler rode up that afternoon, delivering monthly supplies from town, Najoni melted into the shadows of the barn without being told. "Thought I saw an Indian heading into your place," Wheeler said, eyeing Emmett suspiciously as he unloaded flour and coffee. "You want to be careful, Blackwoods. Pierce over at Diamond Bar lost 3 cows to Apache raiders last week." Emmett grunted noncommittally. "Appreciate the warning." That night, he locked the storeroom where he kept supplies and ammunition. Trust went only so far. Days stretched into a week, then 2. Emmett found himself watching Najoni when she wasn't looking, the way she moved with quiet efficiency, how she studied his tools before using them perfectly the next time. She spoke little, but her eyes missed nothing. One afternoon, his bay gelding came in from pasture favoring its left front leg. Emmett led the horse to the corral post, finding a deep cut along the fetlock, already swelling. "Damn it all," he muttered, knowing a lame horse meant trouble he couldn't afford. Najoni appeared beside him, her small medicine pouch in hand. "I help," she said, kneeling to examine the wound. From the pouch she took dried herbs, crushing them between her fingers. She mixed them with water, creating a pungent paste. "Horse medicine?" Emmett asked skeptically. She looked up at him, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Medicine same for all who bleed." Her hands moved with practiced confidence as she cleaned the wound and applied the mixture. The horse, normally skittish with strangers, stood calmly under her touch. She hummed softly, a melody strange to Emmett's ears but somehow soothing. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked as she finished wrapping the leg with a strip of clean cloth. "My grandmother," she said. "She teach me plants, healing." 3 days later, the horse was walking without a limp. "Your medicine worked," Emmett acknowledged, watching her brush down the animal. "Good medicine always work," she replied, "but need respect." The language barrier created its own rhythm between them. Najoni's English improved daily, and sometimes Emmett found himself adopting her direct, unadorned way of speaking. Fewer words, more meaning. On the first day of the 3rd week, Clayton Pierce rode up while they were repairing the chicken coop. Pierce owned the largest spread in the valley, the Diamond Bar, and considered himself spokesman for the scattered ranchers. "Heard you took in a squaw?" Pierce said without preamble, not bothering to dismount. His eyes fixed on Najoni with undisguised contempt. "Hired help," Emmett corrected, stepping slightly between them. "What brings you by, Pierce?" "Neighborly concern," Pierce said, though nothing in his tone suggested concern. "You know the Army's been authorized to round up all these savages. Harboring one could bring trouble." "Appreciate your concern," Emmett replied evenly. "But I run my ranch my way." Pierce's gaze hardened. "That's your right, I suppose. But when the soldiers come asking questions, don't expect the rest of us to stand with you." He turned his horse. "And keep her away from my property. I shoot trespassers, whatever color they are." As Pierce rode away, Emmett felt Najoni's eyes on him. He turned to find her watching him with an unreadable expression. "Why you let me stay?" she asked quietly. "He right. I bring trouble." Emmett had asked himself the same question more than once. "Need the help," he said gruffly, turning back to the chicken coop. "Can't afford to hire a man." That night, after Emmett had gone to bed, Najoni slipped from the barn and stood looking at the stars. The small leather pouch at her waist held all that remained of her previous life. A carved stone that had belonged to her mother, herbs for medicine, a bone all for sewing. Her people were scattered or dead. The reservation was a death sentence of another kind. She had understood every word between the 2 white men. Pierce would bring soldiers sooner or later. The right thing would be to leave, to spare the old rancher the trouble her presence would bring. But where would she go? She touched the medicine pouch, remembering her grandmother's words. Sometimes the path chooses you. Perhaps this path, this weathered ranch, this solitary man, had been chosen for her. When Emmett woke the next morning, he half expected to find her gone. Instead, she was in the garden, carefully tending the rows of vegetables he'd neglected for years. The sight stirred something in him he thought had died with Sarah, a nameless feeling he wasn't ready to examine too closely. Summer gave way to early autumn, painting the distant mountains with splashes of gold and orange. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Emmett found himself thinking ahead to winter for the first time in years. The barn had enough gaps to make it a miserable place to sleep once snow came. He'd been avoiding the decision, but with the first frost already whitening the ground at dawn, he couldn't put it off any longer. "Storage room needs clearing," he told Najoni one evening as they finished the day's work. "Too cold for the barn soon." She looked at him, surprise evident in her normally composed features. "You give me room? In-house?" "It ain't charity," he said gruffly. "Can't have you freezing to death when I need fence mending come spring." The storage room was little more than a lean-to attached to the main cabin, filled with the accumulated debris of 15 solitary years. Together they began sorting through crates and boxes, deciding what to keep, what to burn. In the corner, beneath a tarp, Emmett uncovered a wooden trunk he hadn't looked at in over a decade. He stood motionless, dust motes swirling in the shaft of afternoon light from the small window. Najoni sensed the change in him immediately. She paused in her work, watching as he knelt before the trunk, his hand hovering over the lid without touching it. "Sarah's things," he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear. "My wife." Najoni nodded once and wordlessly moved to continue working elsewhere in the room, giving him privacy. But Emmett didn't open the trunk. After a long moment, he covered it again and moved it against the wall. "I move it other place," Najoni offered. "Not good memories." "No," Emmett said. "It stays. Just needs dusting is all." That evening, for the first time, Emmett didn't retreat to his chair by the fire after supper. Instead, he remained at the table, watching as Najoni cleaned up the kitchen with her usual quiet efficiency. "You had family?" he asked suddenly. "Before soldiers came." She stilled, hands deep in dishwater. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. "Husband," she said finally. "Son. 3 summers old." Her back remained to him, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. "Soldiers come at dawn. Many guns." "I'm sorry," Emmett said, the words inadequate even to his own ears. She turned then, drying her hands on her apron. "You lose wife." "How?" "Childbirth," he answered, the pain dulled by years but never truly gone. "The baby too." "Boy." Najoni nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Same pain," she said simply. "Different causes." It wasn't much as conversations went, but something shifted between them that evening, a recognition of shared loss that went beyond words. The next morning, Emmett found her moving her few possessions into the storage room. She'd swept it clean and hung an old blanket in the window for privacy. The trunk remained undisturbed in the corner. "Bed not needed," she said when he awkwardly mentioned making her a proper one. "I sleep on floor many years." But that evening he dragged in a straw mattress he'd stored in the loft, along with extra blankets. "Gets cold," was all he said before retreating to his own room. As autumn deepened toward winter, their days fell into a comfortable routine. Up at dawn, chores until dusk, quiet evenings by the fire. Najoni's English improved steadily. Emmett found himself talking more than he had in years, explaining ranch operations, sharing knowledge accumulated over a lifetime on the frontier. Sometimes, in the lengthening evenings, he would catch her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not pity, he couldn't have borne that. Something more like understanding. As if she saw the man he'd been before grief had hollowed him out, and didn't find the comparison wanting. It was unsettling, and, if he was honest with himself, not entirely unwelcome. The first snow fell in early December, transforming the ranch into a silent, white expanse. Emmett and Najoni were repairing harness leather by the fire when they heard horses approaching, unusual in such weather. Emmett moved to the window, rifle already in hand. "Army," he said tersely. "Lieutenant and 2 men. Najoni stood immediately. "I hide." "No." Emmett's response surprised them both. "You work here. Nothing to hide." The uncertainty in her eyes was quickly masked, but not before Emmett caught it. Still, she nodded and continued working on the harness, though her fingers weren't quite steady. The lieutenant was young, too young for the arrogance he wore like his crisp uniform. He removed his hat upon entering but kept his gloves on, as if reluctant to touch anything in the cabin. "Lieutenant Graham, 6th Cavalry," he announced. "You're Emmett Blackwoods?" Emmett nodded once, not offering to shake hands. His eyes flicked to the 2 soldiers waiting outside, rifles at the ready. "I'm here on official business, Mr. Blackwoods." The lieutenant produced an official-looking document. "All Apache Indians are required by order of the United States government to report to the San Carlos Reservation. Intelligence suggests you're harboring one." "Not harboring," Emmett replied evenly. "Employing." The lieutenant's gaze shifted to Najoni, who sat straight-backed by the fire, her face carefully blank. "You, woman. Your name?" "Najoni," she answered, her voice quiet but clear. "She works for me," Emmett added. "Has since summer." Lieutenant Graham's mouth thinned with disapproval. "There's no provision for private employment, Mr. Blackwoods. All Apache must report to the reservation. It's for their own protection as well as the safety of settlers." "She's caused no trouble," Emmett said. "I need the help, and there's no law against hiring who I please." "Actually, there is." The lieutenant held up the document. "This directive from the Department of War authorizes the Army to relocate all Apache to designated reservations. Immediately." Emmett remained impassive. "It's 20 miles to San Carlos. Snow's coming in heavy. You plan to march her there tonight?" For the first time, the lieutenant looked uncertain. "Well, no. But then I suggest you continue your patrol and come back when the weather clears," Emmett said reasonably. "She'll still be here." Lieutenant Graham frowned, clearly unhappy with the compromise, but unwilling to force the issue in a snowstorm. "Very well, but I'll return within the week, weather permitting, and I expect full compliance then." He turned to Najoni. "Understood." She nodded once, eyes downcast. After they left, silence filled the cabin. The fire popped and hissed as snow melted on the soldiers' boot prints. "You not have to do that," Najoni said finally. "Now you in trouble too." Emmett returned to his chair, setting the rifle aside. "Bought us some time, that's all." "For what?" Her eyes held his, unblinking. "They come back. Always come back." "Maybe the reservation would be safer," Emmett said, though the words felt wrong even as he spoke them. "Better than hiding." The change that came over her was instant and stark. "No," she said, a fierceness in her voice he'd never heard before. "Reservation is slow death. Disease. Hunger." Her hands clenched in her lap. "They put enemies together. Tribes who fight for generations. No weapons to hunt. No plants for medicine. Children die first." Emmett was silent, absorbing her words and the depth of emotion behind them. "I not go," she finished quietly. "Rather die free." Something in her declaration resonated with a part of Emmett he'd long ignored, the part that had led him to this remote ranch, away from towns and laws and other men's rules. "Nobody's dying," he said gruffly. "And nobody's going to any reservation. Not yet, anyway." That night, alone in his room, Emmett pulled out the lieutenant's document again. The official language couldn't disguise what it was. A paper that declared some people had fewer rights than others. He'd seen similar notices during the war, had followed such orders without question then. He was older now, perhaps a bit wiser. The storm passed, leaving behind 3 feet of snow and crystalline blue skies. Emmett and Najoni spent 2 days clearing paths to the barn and breaking ice on the cattle pond. Despite the cold, the physical labor was almost pleasant, their breath clouding in the winter air, the rhythm of work keeping them warm. They were extending the fence line along the western property boundary when a child's cry pierced the stillness. Emmett looked up sharply, scanning the tree line. A small figure stumbled from the woods, knee-deep in snow. "Help!" The voice was high, frightened. "Please help! Miller's boy!" Emmett muttered, recognizing the child from the nearest neighboring ranch, about 5 miles south. He started forward, then noticed Najoni had already moved toward the child with surprising speed. "Wait!" he called, suddenly conscious of how it would look. An Apache woman approaching a white child. "Let me!" But Najoni had already reached the boy, who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. He was crying, his face red with cold, clutching his arm awkwardly against his chest. "What happened, boy?" Emmett asked, catching up. "F fell from the big oak," the child sobbed. "Ma sent me to fetch Pa from the north field, but I took the shortcut and—" He broke off with a whimper as Najoni gently examined his arm. "Broken," she said, looking up at Emmett. "Needs set soon." The sound of a horse approaching fast had them all turning. A woman rode into view, her face tight with fear until she spotted the boy. "Jimmy!" she cried, nearly falling from the saddle in her haste to dismount. "Thank the Lord! When you didn't come back—" She froze, finally registering Najoni's presence. Her hand went instinctively to the small derringer visible in her coat pocket. "It's all right, Mrs. Miller," Emmett said quickly. "The boy's hurt his arm. My helper was just looking at it." Martha Miller's eyes widened in recognition. "You're Blackwoods." Her gaze darted between him and Najoni, fear and suspicion plain on her face. "I've heard you took in an Indian." "Ma, I hurt my arm real bad," Jimmy whimpered. Mrs. Miller looked torn between fear of Najoni and concern for her son. Emmett saw the moment when maternal instinct won out. "Can you help him?" she asked Najoni directly, though she couldn't quite meet her eyes. "Yes," Najoni replied simply. "Come inside. Need warm water, clean cloth." 20 minutes later, Jimmy sat at Emmett's kitchen table, his arm properly splinted and bound, sipping hot tea sweetened with the last of Emmett's sugar. His mother watched from across the table, her earlier fear gradually giving way to cautious gratitude. "How'd you learn to set bones like that?" she asked Najoni. "My grandmother teach me," Najoni answered, washing her hands in the basin. "She heal many people." "Well, it's a blessing you were here," Mrs. Miller admitted. "Doc Simmons is in Copper Springs, and with Robert out working the north field." She paused, then added awkwardly, "Thank you." Najoni inclined her head slightly, accepting the thanks without comment. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Miller turned to Emmett on the porch, her voice low. "Mr. Blackwoods, I should warn you. There's been talk in town about your arrangement here." She glanced back toward the kitchen where Najoni was wrapping cornbread for Jimmy to take home. "People are saying it ain't proper or safe." "People talk too much," Emmett replied flatly. "Maybe so." She hesitated. "But Clayton Pierce has been talking to the Army officers, and Reverend Abernathy gave a whole sermon last Sunday about the dangers of—" She lowered her voice further, "fraternization with savages." Emmett's jaw tightened. "Appreciate the warning, Mrs. Miller." After they left, Emmett found Najoni cleaning up the kitchen, her movements methodical as always. "You did a good thing," he said. For the boy. She looked up, something unreadable in her dark eyes. Child is child, she said simply. No tribe when pain comes. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Emmett broke their comfortable silence. Things might get difficult, he said. People talking. Army watching. Najoni nodded, unsurprised. I can go, she offered. Find my people in mountains. No, Emmett said, the word coming out more forcefully than he'd intended. Winter's too harsh. Besides, he added, his voice softening slightly, you belong here now. Winter settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket, isolating them from the outside world. The lieutenant didn't return, likely delayed by the succession of storms that swept through the territory. Each morning brought fresh snow and another day of reprieve. One evening, Emmett returned from the barn carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He placed it awkwardly on the table where Najoni was mending one of his shirts. Found this, he said gruffly. Sarah's. No use sitting in a trunk. Najoni carefully unwrapped the bundle to reveal several yards of calico fabric in a faded blue pattern. She looked up at him, questioning. For clothes, he explained. Yours are. He gestured vaguely at her worn dress, patched in multiple places. This was your wife cloth, Najoni said, running her fingers gently over the fabric. You sure? Emmett nodded once. She'd want it used. Over the next few days, Najoni transformed the fabric into a simple dress using Sarah's old sewing box. Emmett found himself pausing in his work to watch her nimble fingers guiding the needle, her face serene in concentration. She hummed sometimes, soft, melodic sounds that made the cabin feel less empty. When she first wore the new dress, something shifted in Emmett's chest, a tightness he hadn't realized was there until it eased. The blue suited her, bringing warmth to her copper skin and highlighting the obsidian darkness of her eyes. Good? She asked, turning slowly, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. Good, he affirmed, his voice rougher than usual. Suits you. Their communication grew more fluid as winter deepened. Najoni's English improved daily, and Emmett found himself learning Apache words. Mostly names for plants and animals, but some everyday terms as well. He resisted at first, feeling foolish wrapping his tongue around the unfamiliar sounds. But her quiet patience wore down his reluctance. Shash, she said one evening, pointing to the bearskin rug before the fire. Shash, he repeated, the word strange in his mouth. She nodded approval. Bigger word. Shashnayali. Mean bear that walks like man. Is that what your people call white men? He asked, half joking. Her expression grew serious. No, we call white men Inda. Mean enemy. She paused, studying his face. But not all Inda same. Before he could respond, a violent thunderclap shook the cabin, unusually loud for a winter storm. Through the window, lightning illuminated the yard in stark white flashes. Horses, Emmett said, rising quickly. Storm might spook them. They worked together in the howling wind and stinging sleet, securing the barn doors and calming the frightened animals. Rain turned to hail, pelting them painfully as they made their final check of the outbuildings. By the time they returned to the cabin, they were both soaked and shivering. Najoni built up the fire while Emmett changed into dry clothes behind the privacy screen in his room. When he emerged, he found her still in her wet dress, wringing water from her long black hair. You'll catch your death, he said, suddenly awkward. Better get changed. She nodded and disappeared into her small room. Emmett busied himself making coffee, trying not to think about her changing just beyond the thin wall. That night, the storm raged with unusual ferocity. Emmett lay awake, listening to the wind howling around the eaves. A different sound caught his attention, a soft cry from Najoni's room. He sat up, listening intently. It came again, a whimper, followed by words in Apache, too quick for him to catch their meaning. Nightmare, he realized. He hesitated, hand already reaching for the door. What was the proper thing to do? Comfort her? Pretend he hadn't heard? Before he could decide, silence fell again. He sat in the darkness, strangely alert to her presence on the other side of the wall. For years, he'd lived with only his own breathing for company at night. Now, the knowledge of another person sleeping nearby felt both foreign and oddly comforting. The next morning, he noticed the shadows under her eyes but said nothing. Some pains were better left unacknowledged. He knew that better than most. January thawed briefly before plunging into deeper cold. On one of the milder evenings, Emmett found himself in his bedroom, sitting at the small desk that had been unused for years. He pulled out a leather-bound journal and opened it, fingers tracing the last entry, dated 2 days after Sarah's death. The pages after were blank, a testament to 15 years of emptiness. He dipped his pen and began to write. Winter's been harsh. Food stores holding. The Apache woman, Najoni, continues to earn her keep. She's quick-minded. Learns faster than any man I've worked with. He paused, pen hovering above the page. She had another nightmare last night. Called out in her sleep. Don't know what demons chase her, but reckon they're not much different from my own. He closed the journal quickly when he heard her moving about in the main room. The scratching of pen on paper had loosened something inside him. Thoughts he wasn't ready to examine too closely. February brought preparation for spring planting. They sorted seed potatoes in the root cellar, the lantern casting long shadows as they worked side by side. These grow good, Najoni said, selecting the strongest specimens. In Apache land we grow corn, beans squashed together. 3 sisters we call. Why sisters? Emmett asked, genuinely curious. Corn grow tall, give bean place to climb. Bean give soil good medicine. Squash leaves cover ground, keep water in soil. She smiled slightly. Sisters help each other. Like family. Never thought of plants that way, Emmett admitted. All things connected, she replied simply. Your people forget this. The judgment was gentle but clear. Emmett found he couldn't disagree. That evening, a knock at the door startled them both. Visitors were rare in the best weather, unheard of in February's chill. Emmett motioned for Najoni to go to her room as he reached for his rifle. Who's there? He called. Clayton Pierce, came the reply. Got Miller and Johansson with me. Emmett opened the door cautiously. 3 men stood on his porch, breath clouding in the cold air. Behind them, more figures waited on horseback. Evening, Blackwoods, Pierce said, not waiting for an invitation before stepping inside. His eyes scanned the cabin. Where's the squaw? What business is that of yours? Emmett asked evenly, not lowering his rifle. Robert Miller, father of the boy whose arm Najoni had set, removed his hat awkwardly. We ain't here for trouble, Blackwoods. Just a neighborly visit. 5 armed men makes for an odd social call, Emmett observed. Pierce's expression hardened. Words got around about your arrangement. Folks are concerned. My arrangement is my business, Emmett replied. And concern doesn't warrant riding out in February darkness. Army's been asking questions, Johansson interjected. Lieutenant came by my place yesterday, asking if anyone's seen Apache in the area. They're looking for a band that hit a stagecoach south of Tucson, Pierce added. Killed the driver and a passenger. He leaned forward slightly. Having an Indian here puts us all at risk. They could think you're harboring raiders. Najoni's been here since summer, Emmett said. Working honest labor every day. She had nothing to do with any raid. Maybe, Pierce conceded. But how can you be sure? These people stick together. For all you know, she's feeding information to her kin. Emmett's grip tightened on his rifle. I think you boys should leave now. Just think about what we're saying, Miller urged. For all our sakes. Send her to the reservation where she belongs. After they left, Emmett found Najoni standing in the doorway of her room. Her face was composed, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. "You here?" he asked. She nodded once. "They afraid. Fear makes men stupid," Emmett muttered. "They come back," she said. "With more men, maybe soldiers." "Let them," Emmett replied, surprising himself with his vehemence. "This is my land. I decide who stays on it." Later, watching Najoni tend the garden she'd started in wooden boxes by the sunniest window, Emmett was struck by the permanence of her actions. Seeds planted now wouldn't bear fruit until summer. She was planning to stay despite the danger. The realization filled him with an unfamiliar warmth. After 15 years of mere existence, he was beginning to think beyond the next day. Winter's grip began to loosen as March arrived, bringing longer days and patches of exposed earth where the sun had melted the snow. The change in seasons seemed to lighten something in both of them, a cautious optimism sprouting alongside the first green shoots in Najoni's window boxes. For months they had taken their meals separately, Emmett at the table, Najoni usually standing by the stove or sitting on a stool in the corner. It had seemed the proper arrangement at first, but increasingly felt like an artificial barrier. One evening, as Najoni set a bowl of stew before him, Emmett made a decision. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "About time we ate like civilized folks." Surprise flickered across her face, quickly masked. "You sure? Wouldn't have said it if I wasn't," he replied gruffly. She hesitated only a moment before bringing her own bowl to the table. They ate in silence at first, the novelty of sharing a meal making them both awkward. But gradually the tension eased. "Good stew," Emmett offered. "Rabbit's tender. Secret is slow cook," she replied. "And juniper berry. That what gives it the tang?" He took another spoonful, savoring the flavor. "Never would have thought of that." A small smile touched her lips. "Many things you never think of." The gentle teasing caught him off guard. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to him with such ease, without the wary respect his neighbors showed or the brisk efficiency of town merchants. Felt good. As their shared meals became routine, their conversations grew longer. Najoni's English had improved dramatically, and Emmett found himself genuinely interested in her stories of Apache life, the seasonal migrations following game, the ceremonies marking life's passages, the complex relationships between bands and families. "Your people lived here long time," Emmett observed one evening. "Must be hard, seeing settlers take the land." She was quiet for a moment, considering. "Land not something to own," she said finally. "My people believe we belong to the land, not land to us." "Wish more white men thought that way," Emmett admitted. "Might be fewer fences, fewer fights." A week later, Jonas Wheeler arrived with the monthly supplies and something unexpected. A newspaper from Tucson, nearly 3 weeks old. "Thought you might want news from the outside world," Wheeler said, handing over the paper along with coffee and flour. "Army's been busy down south. Got most of the Apache rounded up now." After Wheeler left, Emmett set the newspaper aside, uncomfortable with reading it in front of Najoni. But that evening, he found it open on the table, her fingers tracing the headline. "Apache renegades continue to defy Army orders." "You can read," he said, surprised. She looked up, a shadow crossing her face. "Mission school. 2 years before I run away." Her voice held an edge he hadn't heard before. "They try to make us forget who we are." Emmett sat across from her, studying the newspaper between them. "What's it say?" "About your people." "Lies," she replied simply. "Say Apache raid because we like killing. Say we bloodthirsty, cruel." Her eyes met his, challenging. "You believe this?" "6 months ago, maybe," he admitted. "Now?" "No." Something shifted in her expression, a softening around the eyes. "You change your mind easy for old man." Not easy, he corrected. Just had good reason. The next day brought unexpected warmth, a hint of the spring to come. They worked together preparing garden beds, turning over soil still partially frozen beneath the surface. Physical labor had long been Emmett's refuge from troubling thoughts, but today his mind kept returning to the newspaper and what it represented. A world beyond the boundaries of his ranch that viewed Najoni as enemy, as other. "You ever miss your people?" he asked suddenly, straightening from his work. She paused, wiping soil from her hands. "Every day," she answered honestly. "But most gone now. Reservation or dead." "And you're here," Emmett said, the words hanging between them. Not quite a question, not quite a statement. "I hear," she agreed, holding his gaze steadily. For now. The implicit impermanence struck Emmett with unexpected force. He'd grown accustomed to her presence, the quiet efficiency of her movements, her dry observations, the way the cabin felt lived in again. The thought of returning to solitude left an emptiness he wasn't prepared to examine. April arrived with sudden warmth that melted the remaining snow in rushing rivulets down the hillsides. The world seemed to awaken all at once. Birds returning, grass greening, wildflowers dotting the meadows with splashes of color. But the changing season brought its own challenges. As the roads cleared, the isolation that had protected them through winter began to dissolve. Twice Emmett spotted riders in the distance, army patrols he suspected, though none approached the ranch directly. One evening, confined to the cabin by spring rains, Najoni surprised him by producing a small leather pouch. From it, she withdrew a flat piece of charcoal and several sheets of paper, treasures she must have been saving. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the table. Emmett nodded, curious. He watched as she began to draw with swift, sure strokes. Mountains rising from empty space, trees appearing as if by magic. The landscape took shape beneath her fingers, becoming recognizable as the Chiricahua Mountains to the east. "That your home?" he asked. She nodded, adding details to a small valley nestled between peaks. "Summer camp," she explained. "Near water. Good hunting." "You're skilled," Emmett said, genuinely impressed. "Never knew you could draw like that." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Many things you not know yet." She worked on the drawing through the evening, adding a cluster of wiki-ups, Apache dwellings, and tiny figures engaged in daily tasks. When she finished, she pushed the paper toward him. "For you," she said simply. Emmett took it carefully, aware he was being offered something precious. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "I'll keep it safe." In the days that followed, Najoni created more drawings, scenes from Apache life, portraits of people Emmett assumed were family, landscapes both familiar and strange. Each one opened a window into her world, her memories, her loss. One night, as they sat by the fire, Emmett found himself speaking of things long buried. His time in the war, the battles that still haunted his dreams, the comrades lost to bullets and disease. "After Shiloh," he said, staring into the flames, "nothing seemed the same, like the world lost its proper shape." Najoni listened without interruption, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. When he finally fell silent, she said, "My people have word for this. It mean that which causes suffering. Not just enemy, but darkness inside." "That fits," Emmett acknowledged. "Darkness inside. Been carrying it a long time." "Not carry alone now," she said quietly. The simple statement hung in the air between them, profound in its implication. Not alone. When had that happened? When had this Apache woman with her quiet dignity and knowing eyes become someone he trusted with his darkest memories? Their evening conversations became a ritual both looked forward to. Emmett found that speaking of the past somehow lightened its weight, and the nightmares that had plagued him for decades began to come less frequently. Spring planting kept them busy from dawn to dusk. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, broken occasionally by practical questions or observations. Najoni's knowledge of growing cycles and companion planting proved invaluable, her traditional wisdom complementing Emmett's years of practical experience. The arrival of Reverend Abernathy from the church in Copper Springs was unexpected and unwelcome. The thin, severe man appeared one afternoon as they were setting fence posts, his disapproval evident before he even dismounted. "Mr. Blackwoods," he greeted stiffly, "I've come out of Christian concern for your spiritual welfare." Emmett leaned on his shovel. "That so?" The Reverend's gaze shifted to Najoni, who had straightened but continued working. "Word has reached town about your living arrangements. A man and woman residing together unmarried is scandalous enough, but when one is a heathen—" "She works for me," Emmett interrupted. "Nothing improper about it." "Nevertheless," Abernathy persisted, "appearances matter. I've come to offer a solution. The Indian Agency in Tucson has agreed to find a place for her. I can take her there myself, ensure she's treated fairly." Emmett felt a cold anger spreading through his chest. "Appreciate your concern, Reverend, but Najoni stays here." "Mr. Blackwoods, I must insist." "My land, my decision," Emmett said flatly. "Good day to you, Reverend." After Abernathy left, muttering about stubbornness and sin, Najoni approached Emmett. "I bring trouble to you," she said. "Maybe better I go." "No," Emmett replied firmly. "This is your home now. Don't care what anyone thinks about it." May brought wildflowers in profusion, carpeting the hillsides with blues and yellows. Emmett found Najoni gathering them one evening, weaving stems into a simple crown. "For spirits," she explained, seeing his curious look. "Spring ceremony. Thank Mother Earth for new life." That night, she slipped out after supper. From the window, Emmett watched her place the flower crown on a small stone arrangement she'd built near the garden. She sang softly, her voice carrying on the evening breeze, haunting, beautiful, utterly foreign to his ears. He felt like an intruder witnessing something private, yet couldn't look away. Her connection to the land, to traditions that stretched back generations before white men arrived, stirred something in him. Respect, certainly, but also a wistful longing for such rootedness. The next morning, neither mentioned what he'd witnessed. But something had shifted again, another layer of understanding between them. While cleaning the rarely used front room that afternoon, Emmett uncovered something long forgotten. An upright piano pushed against the wall, draped with a faded cloth. Sarah had played, her fingers coaxing gentle melodies that once filled their home with warmth. He stood motionless, hand resting on the dusty cover. 15 years of silence. "What this?" Najoni asked from the doorway. "Piano," Emmett replied, his voice rough. "Sarah's." Najoni approached cautiously, sensing the importance of the moment. "Make music." Emmett nodded, pulling away the cloth to reveal yellowed ivory keys. Najoni reached out tentatively, pressing one key. A sour note broke the silence. "Not sound right," she observed. "Needs tuning," Emmett explained. "Been sitting too long." To his own surprise, he found himself opening the bench, removing tuning tools unused for years. The familiar routine came back to him gradually, adjusting tension, listening for correct pitch, finding the proper intervals. Najoni watched, fascinated. "You know music?" "Not playing," he clarified. "Just tuning. Sarah taught me. She was the musician." When he'd done the best he could, Emmett pressed a key hesitantly. The note rang clear if not perfect. He tried a simple chord, muscle memory guiding his fingers. "You try," he invited, making room on the bench. Najoni sat gingerly beside him, her shoulder brushing his. She pressed keys experimentally, delighting in each sound. "At mission school," she said suddenly, "they teach us songs, church songs." Her fingers found a simple melody, Amazing grace, Emmett realized with surprise. You learned well, he said. A shadow crossed her face. They say our song's evil. Make us sing theirs. Emmett heard the buried pain in her words. Play one of yours? He asked quietly. She hesitated, then began a simple, repeating pattern with her right hand. After a moment, she added her voice. A melody unlike anything Emmett had heard in church. It spoke of open skies and ancient mountains, of a people who read stories in the stars. When she finished, the final notes seemed to linger in the air. Beautiful, Emmett said simply. A fragile smile touched her lips. Music same in all languages. That evening, news arrived of increased army patrols searching for renegade Apache who refused to report to reservations. Jonas Wheeler delivered the information along with their monthly supplies, his expression grave. They're searching every homestead within 50 miles of the Chiricahua Range, he reported. Checking barns, outbuildings, offering rewards for information. After Wheeler left, Emmett paced the cabin, mind racing. We need a plan, he said finally. Somewhere to hide you if they come. Najoni watched him calmly. Root cellar, she suggested. Or cave in North Pasture. Emmett nodded, impressed by her practical thinking. I'll stock both, just in case. That night, unable to sleep, Emmett found himself at Sarah's trunk again. He opened it slowly, breathing in the faint lavender scent that still clung to her things. Among the neatly folded dresses and shawls lay a small velvet box. Inside was his wedding ring, removed after her funeral and never worn since. He held it in his palm, feeling its weight. For 15 years, he'd remained faithful to a ghost, his heart buried alongside her on the hillside. Now, watching the silver glint in the moonlight, he wondered if Sarah would understand the change in him, this gradual awakening to another's presence, another's worth. He replaced the ring in its box but didn't return it to the trunk. Instead, he placed it on his bedside table, an acknowledgement of something not yet fully formed, but undeniably present. June arrived with startling heat, the sun baking the earth and withering anything not regularly watered. Emmett and Najoni fell into the rhythm of summer work, up before dawn to tend the garden and animals before the worst heat set in, resting during the scorching midday, returning to chores as the sun began its descent. They were harvesting early potatoes, their hands working side by side in the dark soil, when their fingers brushed accidentally. A simple touch, yet Emmett felt it like a jolt through his entire body. Najoni stilled for just a moment, her eyes meeting his briefly before returning to her task. Neither spoke of it, but something had been acknowledged, a current running beneath the surface of their daily interactions, powerful and potentially dangerous. That evening, as Emmett washed for supper, he noticed his wedding ring still sitting in its open box on the bedside table. He had worn it faithfully for 5 years of marriage, then carried the memory of it like a phantom weight for 15 more. Now, looking at the simple silver band, he made a decision. He closed the box and placed it in his bureau drawer. Not discarded, but set aside, like the past itself. The next day brought one of the fierce summer thunderstorms common to the territory. It struck suddenly, dark clouds boiling up from the west, wind whipping the trees into a frenzy, lightning splitting the sky in jagged bursts. Creek rising, Najoni warned, pointing toward the normally placid stream that bordered the eastern edge of the property. Already swollen with recent rains, it was quickly becoming a torrent. Cattle, Emmett said tersely, already moving toward the door. They'll be trapped in the lower pasture. Together they fought through the driving rain to the pasture gate. The herd had instinctively moved to higher ground, but 2 calves were stranded on a rapidly shrinking island of land as water rose around them. Without hesitation, Najoni waded into the churning water, Emmett close behind. The current tugged at their legs as they reached the panicked calves. Each taking one, they guided the animals through the deepening water towards safety. They were nearly across when Najoni slipped on the submerged bank, disappearing momentarily beneath the muddy surface. Emmett's heart stopped until her head emerged, sputtering but still gripping the frightened calf's rope. "Take my hand!" he shouted over the storm's fury. Their fingers locked, and he pulled her to the bank, the calf scrambling up behind her. For a moment they stood in the rain, hands still joined, both breathing hard from exertion and relief. "Thought I lost you," Emmett said, the words escaping before he could consider them. Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or understanding. "Not so easy to lose," she replied, a hint of her rare smile appearing despite the rain streaming down her face. By the time they returned to the cabin, both were soaked to the skin and spattered with mud. Emmett built up the fire while Najoni changed behind the privacy screen in her room. When she emerged in her dry dress, hair still damp but neatly braided, Emmett was struck again by her quiet dignity, her composed strength. "Thank you," he said simply. "Couldn't have saved those calves alone." She nodded acceptance of his thanks. "We good team," she observed, the matter-of-fact statement holding more truth than either might have admitted months earlier. That night, as they sat by the fire drying out, Emmett found himself studying her profile in the flickering light. The straight nose, high cheekbones, the slight upward tilt at the corners of her mouth. Not classically beautiful by white standards, perhaps, but striking in her distinctiveness, her complete comfort in her own skin. She caught him looking and held his gaze steadily, neither challenging nor retreating. "What you see?" she asked finally. Emmett considered his answer carefully. "A person," he said. "Not Apache, not woman, just you." Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Good answer, old man." The gentle teasing broke the moment's tension, returning them to safer ground. But something had been acknowledged between them, something neither was quite ready to name, but could no longer entirely ignore. Later, lying awake in bed, Emmett realized he hadn't thought of Sarah all day. The realization brought not guilt, as it once might have, but a sense of quiet wonder. Somehow, without conscious intent, he had begun to live in the present again. July brought shimmering heat that bent the horizon in waves. Emmett and Najoni had settled into an easy routine, their days flowing together like the creek that divided his property. Sometimes rushing, sometimes calm, but always moving forward. The riders appeared just after noon, 6 of them, dust rising behind their horses as they approached from the east. Emmett spotted them from the garden where he and Najoni were harvesting early squash. "Army," he said, recognizing the blue uniforms even at a distance. "Go to the root cellar. Now." Najoni nodded once and slipped away without argument, moving swiftly toward the trapdoor they'd prepared for just this eventuality. Within seconds, she'd disappeared from sight. Emmett wiped his hands on his trousers and walked unhurriedly to meet the riders, his expression neutral despite the pounding of his heart. Lieutenant Graham was in the lead, looking even younger and more officious than Emmett remembered. Behind him rode 2 soldiers Emmett didn't recognize, Clayton Pierce and 2 other local ranchers. "Mr. Blackwoods," Graham called as they approached. "We need to speak with you." "Lieutenant," Emmett acknowledged, nodding to the others. "What brings army and neighbors to my door on such a hot day?" Graham dismounted, removing his hat. "I'm afraid this isn't a social call, sir." He produced an official-looking document. "I have a warrant for your arrest." The words hung in the still air. Emmett kept his expression carefully blank. "Arrest? On what charge?" "Harboring a fugitive Indian," Graham replied, "and potential conspiracy in raids against white settlements." Emmett's jaw tightened. "That's nonsense." "Several witnesses report seeing an Apache woman on your property," Graham continued. "A woman who should have reported to San Carlos Reservation months ago." Pierce stepped forward, his expression smug. "No point denying it, Blackwoods. We've all seen her. Where is she now? Graham demanded, looking past Emmett toward the cabin. Gone, Emmett replied truthfully. Najoni had indeed gone, from sight at least. The soldiers searched the cabin and outbuildings while Pierce and the others watched with barely concealed anticipation. They found nothing, no trace of Najoni's presence. Emmett had been careful over the months to keep her few possessions easily hidden. She's not here, one soldier reported finally. Graham looked frustrated but undeterred. The warrant stands, Mr. Blackwoods. You'll need to come with us to Copper Springs until this matter is resolved. And if I refuse? Emmett asked quietly. The lieutenant's hand moved to his sidearm. Please don't make this difficult, sir. Emmett considered his options. Fighting would only ensure bloodshed and likely lead the soldiers to search more thoroughly, possibly finding Najoni. Going peacefully might buy her time to escape once they were gone. Let me get my hat, he said finally. They took him to the small jailhouse in Copper Springs, a one-room adobe building with 2 cells and a desk for the town marshal. Marshal Davis, a grizzled veteran of border conflicts, looked uncomfortable with the situation. Blackwoods has been a quiet neighbor for 15 years, he told Graham. Hard to believe he's mixed up in raids. He's harboring an Apache woman, Pierce interjected. Who knows what information she's passing to her people? 3 stagecoaches hit in the past month. Settlers killed. Any evidence connecting this particular woman to those raids? Davis asked reasonably. All Indians stick together, one of the ranchers muttered. Blood's thicker than water. Emmett sat silently in his cell, listening to them discuss his fate as if he weren't present. His thoughts were with Najoni. Had she remained hidden, or had she fled once the soldiers left? The uncertainty gnawed at him. On the 3rd day of his confinement, a young lawyer named Henderson approached his cell. Mr. Blackwoods, he said quietly, I've been speaking with the lieutenant. There might be a way to resolve this situation favorably. I'm listening, Emmett replied. If you were to help locate the Apache woman, convince her to surrender to authorities, the conspiracy charges would be dropped. Henderson leaned closer. You'd be free to return to your ranch. All this unpleasantness behind you. Emmett's expression hardened. And Najoni? Henderson shrugged. She'd be sent to San Carlos, as required by law, but she'd be treated fairly. His tone suggested he believed this to be a generous offer. No deal, Emmett said flatly. That night, as Emmett lay on the hard cot in his cell, a soft sound drew his attention to the small window high in the wall. He rose quietly, peering into the darkness. Emmett! The whisper came again, barely audible. His heart lurched. Najoni! Her face appeared briefly at the window, eyes reflecting the moonlight. I come to help you. You shouldn't be here, Emmett whispered urgently. It's too dangerous. Najoni's face remained calm, though her eyes darted occasionally to check her surroundings. Listen, I have plan. Whatever it is, forget it, Emmett insisted. Go. Hide in the mountains. No, she replied firmly. They find you because of me. I not leave you. Despite the danger, warmth spread through Emmett's chest at her words. What's your plan? My cousin's band, she explained quickly. Still free. In mountains east. They help us. Us, Emmett echoed. You think they let you go back to ranch? She asked practically. They watch you always now. Wait for me return. She was right, Emmett realized. Even if he were released, his ranch would become a trap, constantly monitored for Najoni's return or contact with other Apache. My cousin send message, she continued. They guide us south, to Mexico. Mexico, Emmett repeated, the word both foreign and tantalizing. A place beyond the reach of the U.S. Army, beyond the prejudices of Arizona territory. Must decide quick, Najoni pressed. Henderson talked to Marshall tomorrow about letting you out if you help find me. How did you know about Henderson? Emmett asked, surprised. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. I listen at window before I speak. Learn much. Of course she had. Emmett shook his head, torn between admiration and exasperation. Listen, she said urgently. You tell Henderson you help find me. Say I hiding in cave near ranch. They take you there to show. My cousins wait in canyon beyond. We slip away, go south. It's risky, Emmett said. If they catch us, die free better than live prisoner, she replied simply. After she disappeared into the night, Emmett paced his cell, mind racing. Mexico, leaving everything he'd built over 15 years. Becoming a fugitive. The rational part of him rebelled at the idea. And yet, the alternative, returning to a closely watched ranch, always wondering where Najoni was, if she was safe, seemed unbearable. The next morning, when Henderson returned, Emmett was ready. I've been thinking about your offer, he said carefully. Maybe we can help each other. Henderson looked pleased. I knew you'd see reason, Mr. Blackwoods. Najoni, the Apache woman, has a hiding place, Emmett continued. A cave in the hills behind my ranch. I can take you there. Excellent, Henderson said. I'll speak to the lieutenant immediately. Events moved quickly after that. By noon, Emmett found himself riding beside Lieutenant Graham, hands loosely bound before him, heading toward his ranch. 4 soldiers followed, along with Henderson and, to Emmett's dismay, Clayton Pierce. Pierce knows the terrain, Graham explained when Emmett questioned his presence. And he was most helpful in building the case against you. Of course he was, Emmett thought bitterly. They reached the ranch by mid-afternoon. Emmett felt a pang seeing the garden already wilting from neglect. The cattle gathered uncertainly by the gate. The cave's beyond the north pasture, he told Graham. Through the stand of cottonwoods. As they rode, Emmett spotted the subtle signs Najoni had described. A pile of stones arranged in a specific pattern, branches broken in a way that would appear natural to untrained eyes but formed clear directions to those who knew how to read them. The cave itself was real, a shallow opening in the hillside that Emmett had shown Najoni months earlier. But it would be empty, he knew. The real destination was the narrow canyon beyond, where her cousin's band waited. It's just ahead, Emmett said as they approached the cave entrance. She may be hunting. She usually returns by dusk. Graham signaled his men to spread out and approach cautiously. As they focused on the cave, Emmett's eyes scanned the ridge above. A flash of movement, barely perceptible, confirmed they weren't alone. I should check inside first, Emmett suggested. She trusts me. If soldiers go in with guns, she might run. Graham hesitated, then nodded. Pierce, go with him. The rest of us will cover the entrance. This was a complication. Emmett's mind raced as Pierce dismounted alongside him, hand resting on his pistol. After you, Blackwoods, Pierce said with poorly concealed triumph. Let's see this Apache woman of yours. As they approached the cave entrance, Emmett noticed a small stone carving placed just inside. An Apache fetish he recognized from Najoni's descriptions. Coyote, the trickster, a warning or a promise. He stepped into the cool darkness, Pierce close behind him, knowing the next few moments would determine both their fates. The cave extended deeper than it appeared from outside, narrowing to a passage barely wide enough for a man to walk upright. Emmett moved confidently, as if he'd traversed it many times before, though in truth he'd only gone a few yards in during previous explorations. How much further? Pierce demanded, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. Just around this bend, Emmett replied, feeling his way along the rough wall. The passage curved sharply, then opened into a small chamber. Emmett's eyes, adjusted to the dimness, immediately spotted the evidence of recent occupation. A folded blanket, the remains of a small fire, a water skin hanging from a jutting rock. Najoni had prepared well. She was here, Emmett said, gesturing to the items. Must have heard us coming. Pierce examined the fire pit, touching the ashes. Still warm, he confirmed. She can't be far. He turned back toward the entrance. Lieutenant, we've found her camp. Emmett's eyes darted around the chamber, looking for the exit Najoni had promised. On the far wall, partially hidden by shadows, a narrow fissure cut through the rock, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Graham and 2 soldiers joined them, crowding the small space. She's likely fled deeper into the cave system, Emmett suggested, pointing away from the hidden exit. There are passages that run for miles under these hills. Graham frowned. We'll need more men to search thoroughly. Pierce, ride back to town and bring reinforcements. A scattering of pebbles from outside the cave interrupted him. Then a woman's voice, Najoni's, called something in Apache, the words echoing eerily. It's her, one of the soldiers exclaimed. Careful, Graham warned. Could be a trap. They hurried back toward the entrance, leaving Emmett momentarily unguarded. It was the chance he'd been waiting for. He slipped silently toward the fissure in the rock wall, squeezing through the narrow opening. Beyond was another passage, this one sloping steeply upward. Emmett followed it, his bound hands making the climb awkward. The passage twisted, turned, then suddenly opened onto the hillside above the cave. A hidden exit exactly as Najoni had described. She waited there, crouched behind a boulder, a knife in her hand. Turn, she instructed, quickly cutting his bonds. Must hurry. They realize soon. How did you? Emmett began. Later, she interrupted. Now we run. They moved swiftly along the ridge, keeping low to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. Below, they could hear shouts as the soldiers discovered Emmett's absence. This way, Najoni said, guiding him into a dry streambed that offered cover while they descended into the canyon beyond. As the sun began to set, they reached a small clearing where 3 Apache men waited with horses. One stepped forward, a man about Emmett's age with a face weathered by sun and hardship. My cousin, Najoni explained. Nate. The man nodded once to Emmett, his expression revealing nothing. He not speak English, Najoni said, but understand some. They mounted quickly, Emmett on a sturdy pinto that looked like it had been chosen specifically for a man of his size and weight. As they rode deeper into the canyon, he marveled at the preparation that had gone into this rescue. Najoni must have been planning for this possibility for some time. How long have you been in contact with your cousin? He asked as they rode. Since winter, she admitted. Leave messages at special place. He check when can. Emmett absorbed this information. All those months, she'd maintained a connection to her people without him knowing. The realization wasn't entirely comfortable. You never mentioned it, he said quietly. She glanced at him, reading his expression in the fading light. Was protecting you, she explained. What you not know, you not have to lie about. He couldn't argue with her logic. They rode through the night, following game trails and ancient Apache paths invisible to white men's eyes. By dawn, they had covered nearly 20 miles, moving steadily southeast. During a brief rest to water the horses, Emmett pulled Nate aside, using Najoni to translate. I need to return to the ranch, he explained. Just long enough to get something important. Najoni's eyes widened. Too dangerous, she protested. Soldiers watch ranch now. Not the main house, Emmett clarified. The old line shack on the east boundary. I need to get something I stored there. After rapid discussion in Apache between Najoni and Nate, she turned back to Emmett. He say very foolish, but he help. Send one man with you. Before they parted, Emmett took Najoni's hand, an intimacy he wouldn't have dared months earlier. Trust me, he said simply. Her dark eyes searched his face. Always, she replied. The distant sound of a bugle cut through the dawn mist. The army's morning call, likely from a patrol camped nearby. Emmett and his Apache guide, a silent, intense man called Taza, exchanged glances. They'd have to be even more careful than planned. They'd left the others continuing southeast while they doubled back toward Emmett's ranch, taking a circuitous route to avoid detection. Now, crouched among scrub pines on a ridge overlooking the property, Emmett surveyed the situation below. 2 soldiers stood guard on his front porch. Another pair patrolled the perimeter. His ranch had become a military outpost overnight. "Line shack that way," Emmett whispered, pointing east. "Quarter mile." Taza nodded, eyes constantly scanning for movement. They descended the ridge cautiously, using gullies and brush for cover. The line shack, little more than a one-room shelter built for cowboys working the far pastures, came into view. It appeared unguarded. "Wait here," Emmett murmured. "Watch for patrols." He approached the shack in a low crouch, every sense alert. The door creaked slightly as he eased it open, triggering a moment of frozen tension. When no reaction came, he slipped inside. The interior was dim and dusty, exactly as he'd left it months ago. He moved directly to the loose floorboard in the corner, prying it up to reveal a small space beneath. From it, he withdrew an oilcloth package and a leather document case. The package contained emergency funds, gold coins he'd been saving for years, insurance against disaster. The case held the deed to his ranch and other important papers. He tucked both inside his shirt and was turning to leave when a sound outside froze him in place. Hoofbeats. Multiple riders approaching. Through a crack in the wall, he spotted 3 men on horseback, Pierce and 2 others he didn't recognize. Not soldiers, but local ranchers. They were moving slowly, rifles ready, clearly searching. Emmett's hand went to his pistol, returned to him by Nate during their flight. For shots, for men. But the gunfire would attract the soldiers at the main house. He glanced around the shack, looking for options. The back window was small but might be large enough. As the riders drew closer, he eased the window open and slipped out, landing in a crouch behind the building. Taza materialized beside him like a shadow, gesturing urgently toward a nearby ravine. They moved silently through the brush, freezing whenever the voices of the searchers grew louder. They were almost clear when a shout went up. "Tracks! Fresh ones! Heading east!" Pierce's voice carried clearly, "Spread out! They can't be far." Abandoning stealth for speed, Emmett and Taza ran for the ravine. Gunshots cracked behind them, bullets spitting dirt at their heels. They plunged into the dry streambed, scrambling over rocks and fallen trees. The ravine provided cover but slowed their progress. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Pierce and his men had dismounted and were following on foot. "We need to split up," Emmett told Taza through gestures and broken Apache words Najoni had taught him. "Draw them away." Taza understood immediately. He pointed Emmett toward a game trail that led south, then headed in the opposite direction, deliberately leaving visible tracks. Emmett moved as quickly as he dared, the precious package secure against his chest. The rendezvous point was still miles away. If he could reach it by nightfall, they had a chance. By midday, the July heat had become punishing. Emmett's canteen was nearly empty, his legs leaden with fatigue. He'd heard no sounds of pursuit for hours but couldn't risk stopping. He was crossing an exposed stretch of tableland when a wave of dizziness struck. Too much sun, too little water. He stumbled, caught himself, then staggered to the meager shade of a stunted juniper. Just a brief rest, he told himself. 5 minutes to cool down. Then onward. He woke with a start, horrified to realize he'd lost consciousness. The sun had moved significantly, at least 2 hours had passed. He cursed himself for the dangerous delay and rose shakily. A distant dust cloud to the north caught his attention. Riders moving fast. Whether soldiers or Pierce's men, he couldn't tell. But they were between him and the rendezvous point. Emmett changed direction, heading for a series of rocky hills to the southeast. If he could reach them before being spotted, the broken terrain might hide him. His body protested every step, and used to such punishment after years of ranch work. But the thought of Najoni waiting, perhaps already fearing him captured or dead, drove him forward. As the sun began to set, he finally reached the hills, collapsing behind a boulder at the base of a steep slope. His water was gone, his strength nearly so, and still miles to go before the rendezvous. Should have let her go, he muttered to himself. Let her escape alone. But even as the thought formed, he knew he couldn't have done it. Somewhere in the past year, his fate had become inexorably linked with hers. Night fell, bringing blessed coolness to the parched land. Emmett pushed on through the darkness, navigating by stars as he'd learned from Najoni. The rocky hills gave way to sparse grassland, then a series of dry washes leading toward the rendezvous canyon. His mouth was paper dry, his legs moving on stubborn determination alone. The thought of Najoni waiting, perhaps in danger because of his delay, drove him forward when his body begged to stop. Dawn was breaking when he spotted the distinctive twin peaks that marked the canyon entrance. Relief surged through him, giving new strength to his weary limbs. Then he heard them, horses approaching from the west. 3 riders moving at a steady trot. Even at a distance, he recognized Pierce's broad-shouldered silhouette. Somehow they'd anticipated his destination. Emmett quickened his pace, though his legs protested the effort. The canyon mouth was still half a mile away. No chance of reaching it before the riders intercepted him. He needed to draw them away from Najoni and the others. Changing direction, he headed toward a rocky outcropping that offered both visibility and defensible position. If he could delay Pierce long enough, perhaps Najoni would realize something had gone wrong and continue south without him. The thought brought a surprising pang. After a lifetime of self-reliance, the idea of not seeing her again felt like physical pain. Reaching the outcropping, Emmett positioned himself among the boulders, pistol ready. Pierce and his men approached cautiously, fanning out to surround the rocks. "Know you're in there, Blackwoods," Pierce called. "No way out this time." Emmett remained silent, conserving his strength. For bullets, 3 men. Not ideal odds, but he'd faced worse during the war. "All this for an Indian woman," Pierce continued, disgust evident in his voice. "Throwing away your ranch, your reputation. For what? A savage who'll slit your throat first chance she gets." Emmett's finger tightened on the trigger. One shot would silence Pierce forever. But gunfire would alert any patrols in the area, endangering Najoni further. "Just come out," Pierce urged, his tone shifting to false reasonableness. "Army only wants the woman. You cooperate now, might still be a way back for you." "Like you care what happens to me?" Emmett finally responded, his voice rough from thirst. "We were neighbors once," Pierce replied, "before you lost your senses over this squaw." "Her name is Najoni," Emmett said coldly, "and she's worth 10 of you, Pierce." A bullet splintered rock near Emmett's head, Pierce's answer to the insult. The standoff had begun. For nearly an hour, they exchanged occasional shots, neither side gaining advantage. Emmett rationed his bullets carefully, firing only when certain of his target. He wounded one of Pierce's men in the shoulder, reducing their effective number to 2. The sun climbed higher, baking the rocks around him. Thirst became a torment worse than the bullets. Emmett's vision began to blur at the edges, dehydration taking its toll. Just as he was considering a desperate charge, movement on the ridge above caught his attention. A flash of blue fabric, Najoni's dress, quickly concealed behind rocks. His heart sank. She hadn't fled. She'd come looking for him. Pierce had seen it too. Well, he called. "Looks like your woman's come to join the party, Blackwoods." Emmett watched in helpless horror as Pierce directed his remaining man to circle toward the ridge where Najoni was hidden. "No," he shouted. "Pierce, this is between us. Leave her out of it." But Pierce merely smiled, cold and triumphant. "Should have taken the Army's deal, Blackwoods. Too late now." Desperate, Emmett broke cover, firing his remaining bullets at Pierce to draw attention away from Najoni. One grazed Pierce's arm, tearing a furious curse from him. But Emmett's gun was now empty, and he stood exposed. Pierce raised his rifle, hatred contorting his features. "Should have done this months ago," he snarled. A shot cracked across the landscape, but it wasn't from Pierce's gun. The rancher jerked, confusion replacing hatred as he looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest. He toppled slowly from his horse. Emmett spun toward the sound of the shot. Standing on the ridgeline was not Najoni, but a young cavalry officer, Lieutenant Graham, rifle still raised. "Mr. Blackwoods," Graham called, lowering his weapon. "I believe we need to talk." Lieutenant Graham approached cautiously, rifle lowered but ready. Pierce's remaining man had fled at the first shot, disappearing into the hills. "That was Pierce's second attempt to kill an unarmed man this week," Graham said, nodding toward the fallen rancher. "Seems he had personal reasons for wanting you and the Apache woman found." Emmett remained tense, wary of the unexpected intervention. "Why would you care?" Graham's youthful face showed unexpected weariness. "2 nights ago, I found documents in Pierce's saddlebag when he thought I wasn't looking. Orders to drive Apache from lands he wanted for grazing. Forged Army letterhead." He shook his head. "Been using us to settle his grudges and expand his ranch." "And you shot him for that?" Emmett asked skeptically. "I shot him because he was about to murder a man in cold blood," Graham replied evenly. "As for the rest," he hesitated. "The Apache woman, Najoni. She saved my life yesterday." Emmett's surprise must have shown on his face. "I was scouting alone," Graham explained. "Rattlesnake spooked my horse. Threw me, dragged me half a mile." He touched his bandaged arm. "Found myself miles from my patrol, bleeding badly. She appeared from nowhere, treated the wound, gave me water." His eyes met Emmett's. "Could have left me to die. No one would have known." Before Emmett could respond, movement on the ridge caught their attention. Najoni emerged from the rocks, approaching cautiously, Nate and the others visible behind her. "It's all right," Emmett called to her in Apache, using the phrases she'd taught him. "He friend." She reached them, her eyes quickly assessing Emmett's condition. "You hurt?" she asked, noting his exhaustion. "Just thirsty," he assured her, accepting the water skin she offered. Graham watched their interaction with thoughtful eyes. "You're heading for Mexico," he said. Not a question. Neither Emmett nor Najoni answered, but their silence was confirmation enough. "The border's still 50 miles south," Graham continued. "Army patrols the whole region. You planning to stop us?" Emmett asked quietly. Graham was silent for a long moment, internal conflict visible on his young face. Finally, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "This is a pass," he explained. "Says I've hired you as a scout to check reports of Apache movement near the border. Won't stand up to serious scrutiny, but most patrols won't question an officer's paperwork." He handed it to Emmett. "Should get you through to the border." Emmett took the paper, stunned by the unexpected aid. "Why?" "A debt repaid," Graham said simply, nodding to Najoni. "And perhaps—" He hesitated. "Perhaps because some orders shouldn't be followed." With that, he mounted his horse. "I never saw you," he said. "And you never saw me. Clear?" Emmett nodded once. "Clear." As Graham rode away, Najoni stepped closer to Emmett. "Good man," she observed. "Young, but wise." "Rare combination," Emmett agreed. Nate approached, speaking rapidly to Najoni. After a brief exchange, she turned to Emmett. "Need to move. More soldiers may come." 6 days later, they crossed the border into Mexico, traveling by night, hiding by day. Graham's pass had indeed gotten them through 2 army checkpoints without issue. The small village of San Miguel welcomed them with surprising warmth. Mixed marriages between Mexicans, Indians, and Anglo settlers were common here, their presence raising few eyebrows. With the gold he'd retrieved from the line shack, Emmett purchased a small adobe house on the edge of town. It wasn't much, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, but it offered something his ranch never had: peace. One evening, as autumn painted the distant mountains with gold and crimson, Emmett and Najoni sat outside their new home, watching the sunset. A letter had arrived that morning from Robert Miller's son, who had purchased Emmett's ranch at a sheriff's auction. "He says the army's moved on," Emmett reported, folding the letter. "New commander at Fort Bowie doesn't care about one missing Apache woman." Najoni nodded, unsurprised. Small things forgotten quick when big things happen. She had adapted to their new life with characteristic resilience, already establishing a small garden that combined vegetables from both their traditions. The local children had begun coming to her for treatment of minor ailments, drawn by her gentle hands and effective remedies. "Any regrets?" Emmett asked, watching her profile in the fading light. She turned to him, the question in her eyes. "About staying with me," he clarified. "Could have rejoined your people. Gone north." Najoni's hand found his, her fingers strong and certain. "My path," she said simply. "I choose it." As darkness fell, they rose together and walked into the house they now shared. No longer rancher and helper, no longer white man and Apache woman. Just 2 people who had found, against all odds, a place to belong.